At 2:17 in the morning, the room is finally quiet enough to hear the smallest things. The soft hum of electricity in the wall, the faint settling of the house, the fabric of the pillow shifting under the weight of a tired head. By now, the body has already given its answer. The shoulders are heavy. The eyes sting a little. The day has long since spent itself. And yet, somewhere behind the forehead, the mind has not joined the darkness. It is still awake, still turning, still holding on to some thin wire of attention that it does not seem able to release. This is one of the stranger experiences in ordinary human life. We tend to assume that tiredness should lead naturally to sleep, the way hunger leads us toward food, or thirst toward water. But night after night, millions of people discover that this is not always true. A person can be exhausted and still unable to rest. The body can plead for sleep while the mind continues its quiet work, replaying old conversations, anticipating tomorrow, noticing the clock, noticing the heartbeat, noticing the fact of not sleeping. And once that noticing begins, it can feel as though the night itself has changed shape. The bed is no longer only a place of comfort. It becomes a place of waiting. What makes this so unsettling is that sleep is supposed to be the most natural thing we do. It arrives in infancy before language, before discipline, before any conscious skill. We do not learn it the way we learn mathematics or music. We fall into it, or at least, we are meant to. So when sleep does not come, the failure feels oddly personal. People begin to ask what they are doing wrong, why the mind refuses to be still, why effort only seems to make the problem worse. In that silent tension between exhaustion and wakefulness, a deeper question begins to emerge. Perhaps the sleepless night is not simply a missing off switch. Perhaps it is a window into how the mind responds to uncertainty, effort, memory, time, and control. So why does a tired mind refuse to rest when rest is exactly what it needs? And how does one difficult night slowly become a pattern that begins to shape the whole of a life lived in daylight? There is a particular stillness that belongs to late night when the rest of the world has already withdrawn. The conversations are over. The dishes have long been put away. The glow from windows across the street has thinned out, one by one, until only a few stubborn rectangles of light remain in the dark. Inside the room, almost everything seems to be cooperating with sleep. The lamps are off. The blanket is warm. The body, after a full day of moving through obligations, noise, screens, errands, decisions, and small invisible strains, has finally become heavy enough to settle. The eyes sting a little. The jaw loosens. The limbs feel as though they are asking to be laid down rather than carried any further. On the surface, this should be enough. Fatigue has arrived. Night has arrived. Rest should follow as quietly as a tide moving in. And yet, this is often the very hour when a strange division begins to reveal itself. The body lies down, but the mind does not, or rather, some part of the mind does not. It stays behind, alert in a way that feels thin and almost absurd, like a single light left burning in a vast house that is otherwise dark. Thought does not always come as a dramatic storm. Sometimes it is only a low, persistent turning. A sentence from earlier in the day returns with fresh emphasis. tomorrow's obligations begin quietly assembling themselves in the dark. A forgotten task rises into consciousness. An old embarrassment, one that should by all logic have dissolved years ago, drifts back with unreasonable clarity, even when there is no obvious worry attached to any of it. Attention itself remains present. The mind keeps touching things. It keeps lifting them, turning them, measuring them, placing them back down, and lifting them again. This is one of the stranger experiences in ordinary life, because it seems to violate a rule so basic that most of us rarely examine it. We assume that if the body is tired enough, sleep will come. We make this assumption for good reason. On many nights it does. Sleep, when it works as expected, feels less like an achievement than like gravity. It does not need to be summoned. It simply takes hold. The day thins, the edges of thought begin to blur, and consciousness yields without ceremony. Because that process is usually so natural, we come to treat it as automatic. We may ignore it for years. We may even take pride in neglecting it, as though rest were a luxury and wakefulness a sign of strength. Then one night arrives when sleep does not come on schedule, and suddenly the whole machinery of the mind becomes visible through its failure. The first feeling is often surprise. A person glances at the clock, not yet anxious, only mildly puzzled. Perhaps more time has passed than expected. Perhaps the room has grown too quiet. Perhaps the body still feels tired, but not sleepy in the right way. Not as if it is sliding downward, only as if it is worn out and still somehow suspended. That distinction matters, even if most people would never describe it in those terms. Tiredness and sleepiness are close companions, but they are not identical. Tiredness can mean depletion, irritability, mental fog, heaviness in the muscles, a sense that the day has taken too much. Sleepiness is something more specific. It is a movement toward sleep, a softening of attention, a readiness in the nervous system to disengage. At night, these states often travel together, but sometimes they separate, and when they do, the result can feel deeply confusing. A person can be weary in every ordinary sense and still remain stubbornly awake. The confusion quickly becomes personal, since sleep is supposed to happen without effort. Its absence feels oddly revealing, as if the night has discovered a flaw hidden beneath the surface of an otherwise competent life. During the day, most forms of difficulty invite action. If a door is stuck, one pushes harder. If a problem at work becomes complicated, one concentrates more intensely. If a task resists completion, one applies discipline, technique, or time. These habits of mind are useful almost everywhere else. They help people survive the day. But in the dark, lying still, trying to fall asleep, those same habits begin to behave differently. The will leans forward. Attention sharpens. Effort enters the room. And the thing being pursued begins to move further away. This is part of what makes the sleepless night so unnerving. Sleep does not respond well to being chased. A person cannot will the exact moment of falling asleep in the same way one can will the hand to clench or the mouth to speak. One can dim the lights, close the eyes, put away the phone, slow the breathing, and remain very tired indeed. One can create favorable conditions, but the final crossing itself cannot be forced directly. It belongs to a region of human life that is less like performance and more like surrender. That word can sound vague until one has spent enough time lying awake to understand it physically. The sleepless person is often doing everything that looks like rest from the outside while inwardly remaining in a posture of effort. The body is horizontal, but the mind is standing up. So the night begins to change shape. It is no longer merely a quiet interval between one day and the next. It becomes a place of testing. The pillow is adjusted, the blanket pulled higher, then lower. A new sleeping position is tried with a kind of hopeful logic, as though the angle of the shoulder or the placement of the leg might finally unlock what the mind has failed to release. Minutes pass. The clock is consulted again, sometimes despite a private promise not to look. That small movement toward the glowing numbers can feel almost irresistible, as though uncertainty itself has become intolerable. Yet the information rarely brings comfort. It only converts vague unease into arithmetic. There are now 5 hours left, now 4.5, now less. The night, which ought to have been open and indistinct, begins to harden into measurable loss. At that point, the body may grow even more tired while the mind becomes more alert to the fact of not sleeping. This is the paradox at the heart of the sleepless night. The problem is not simply an absence. It is not just that sleep is missing. Something else has taken its place. Awareness has thickened. Attention, instead of fading, has narrowed around the very question of whether sleep is arriving. Small sensations that would usually disappear beneath drowsiness begin to stand out. The beat of the heart, the warmth of the face against the pillow, the dryness in the throat, the pressure behind the eyes. Even normal fluctuations in the body can begin to feel unusually pronounced when observed in silence. The mind, deprived of the easy slide into sleep, turns toward itself and begins to monitor. What it monitors depends on the person. For some, the mind replays the day. For others, it rushes toward tomorrow and begins living tomorrow in advance. There are those who mentally rehearse conversations that have not happened, defend themselves against criticisms no one has yet spoken, predict failures, imagine fatigue, picture themselves moving badly through the next morning. Others become preoccupied with the sleep itself. Why am I still awake? What is wrong with me tonight? How will I function tomorrow? Why does this always seem to happen when I need sleep most? None of these thoughts have to be extreme in order to be activating. A quiet mind can be kept awake by very modest forms of vigilance. It is enough that some part of consciousness has taken the night as a problem to solve. From the outside, this can seem trivial. After all, everyone loses sleep once in a while. A noisy street, an argument, a late flight, a feverish child, a hard season at work, an unfamiliar hotel room. Human beings are not machines designed to descend into sleep with perfect consistency. There has probably never been a person alive who has not known, at least occasionally, the peculiar frustration of being ready for bed and not ready for sleep. In that sense, a wakeful night does not necessarily mean anything alarming. It can be a passing disturbance, an understandable response to a mind that has not yet finished carrying the day. But the reason this ordinary experience deserves such close attention is that it reveals something essential about sleep itself. It shows that sleep is not merely the mechanical reward for being exhausted. It is a state that depends on a delicate coordination between tiredness and release, between the body's need for rest and the nervous system's willingness to stop keeping watch. That willingness is more fragile than people often realize. Human beings carry into the night the same brain that helped them survive daylight. It is a brain built to notice change, anticipate threat, remember unfinished things, detect patterns, and prepare for what comes next, most of the time, by late evening. Those functions quiet enough to allow sleep to gather around them, but they do not disappear on command, under the wrong conditions. They remain active. They may even become more pronounced in the stillness because there is so little else competing for attention. Daytime crowds the mind with external demands. Night strips many of those away, leaving a clearer encounter with what remains within. That is why a person can feel calmer at bedtime than during the busiest part of the afternoon, and still find the mind harder to quiet. In silence, smaller thoughts grow louder. There is also something humbling in the way the night exposes the limits of self-control. Modern life tends to reward the impression that enough effort can solve almost anything. Improve your habits, optimize your schedule, push through fatigue, learn the system, master the technique. These ideas are seductive because they often work, at least partly, in the domains where action produces visible results. But sleep sits somewhat outside that logic. It can be supported, respected, protected, and made more likely. It cannot be wrestled into place by sheer determination. In fact, the harder one strains toward it, the more awake the mind may become. This is not because the person has failed morally or lacks discipline. It is because the state of mind required for sleep is almost the opposite of strain. Sleep asks the organism to stop monitoring the world, stop preparing for the future, stop checking for results. It asks for a falling away of management. Many people do not realize how difficult that is until they discover, in the dark, that they cannot do it on request. The result can feel deeply lonely, not because one is physically alone, but because wakefulness at night changes the scale of experience. Problems that seemed containable at noon begin to feel larger at 2 in the morning. Time itself becomes strange. A single hour can feel enormous when it is measured not by events, but by failed attempts to disappear into sleep. The house seems to belong to another reality. Even familiar objects begin to take on the stillness of witnesses. The chair in the corner, the crack of light under the door, the faint outline of a curtain moving against the window. All of it participates in a quiet that is somehow peaceful to the world and accusatory to the person who remains awake within it. One begins to feel left behind by the night rather than carried by it. Yet there is an important tenderness hidden inside this experience. The mind that will not rest is not necessarily rebellious, damaged, or irrational in any simple sense. On many nights, it is doing what minds do when they sense unresolved things. It keeps holding the thread. It keeps returning to what feels unfinished, uncertain, or potentially important. Sometimes that vigilance is plainly connected to stress. Sometimes it appears when life is outwardly calm. Because the habit of watchfulness has become more deeply rooted than the immediate circumstances that once provoked it. But even before any of those explanations are fully understood, one thing becomes clear. The sleepless night is not just about lacking sleep. It is about the presence of a certain kind of consciousness. one that remains poised, attentive, and unable to release its grip when release is exactly what is needed. That is why tiredness alone is not enough. Fatigue can fill the muscles, cloud the eyes, and slow the day. But sleep asks for more than depletion. It asks for a shift in the whole posture of the organism. The world must feel safe enough, the mind unoccupied enough, the body timed well enough, and the inner guard relaxed enough for consciousness to loosen. When that loosening does not happen, the person lying awake often blames the wrong thing. They blame a lack of will, a lack of discipline, a defective night, a defective self. Yet the more revealing truth is simpler and more unsettling. A human being can want sleep sincerely, need it desperately, and still remain awake because wanting and needing are not the same as entering the conditions that allow it. So the first lesson of the restless night is not that sleep is fragile in some melodramatic way, nor that the mind is an enemy to be subdued. It is that rest depends on a relationship between body and mind that cannot be reduced to simple tiredness. This is why the problem feels so intimate. It occurs in silence, at close range, where people meet their own minds without distraction. For a while. That encounter may remain occasional, nothing more than a passing frustration folded into the larger rhythm of life. But for some, the puzzling night does not stay singular. What begins as a temporary disturbance starts to leave a trace. The next bedtime is approached with a little more awareness. The next night carries a memory, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, a person can begin moving from the simple experience of not sleeping toward the more complicated experience of wondering whether sleep will fail again. That is where the story deepens. Because the first bad nights are rarely only about darkness, tiredness, or missing rest. They are about the moment an ordinary human difficulty begins to gather a pattern of its own. At first, the sleepless nights usually make sense. That is part of what makes them easy to dismiss. Wakefulness does not always arrive in the middle of some obvious crisis. More often, it appears during seasons of ordinary strain, a week of deadlines, a difficult conversation that keeps echoing after it should have ended, a stretch of travel that leaves the body slightly displaced from itself, a family illness, a breakup that is outwardly over but inwardly still unfolding, financial worry, a move to a new home where the room is unfamiliar and the sounds outside the window feel just a little wrong. Sometimes the cause is clear enough to name. Sometimes it is only a general accumulation. The slow pressure of too many demands carried without pause. But in the beginning, the wakefulness usually feels explainable. It does not yet seem mysterious. It feels connected to life. A person lies awake and thinks, of course sleep is difficult tonight. Too much happened. Too much remains unsettled. The day has not fully released its hold. This explanation is often comforting because it preserves a simple logic. The mind is active for a reason. The body is tense for a reason. Once the stressful event passes, once the routine becomes normal again, once the uncertainty softens, rest will return on its own. And many times, that is exactly what happens. A few poor nights remain just that. The nervous system absorbs the disruption, carries it for a while, and then gradually lets it go. sleep returns quietly. The bad stretch fades into the background of ordinary life. But not every mind passes through strain in the same way. That difference is easy to miss because it is often invisible from the outside. Two people can live through the same difficult week and sleep very differently. One may struggle briefly, then recover almost without noticing. The other may begin to feel that the night itself has changed. Sleep no longer seems automatic. It now feels uncertain, delicate, something that may or may not arrive. This does not necessarily mean the second person is weaker, more dramatic, or less resilient. It may simply mean that their system reacts more strongly to disruption. Some people seem to have a lower threshold for nighttime alertness. Their inner world stirs more easily. The bridge between daytime strain and nighttime rest is narrower. Once crossed, it is harder to cross back. That vulnerability often hides for years. A person may have always been a light sleeper, the sort of child who woke at small noises, the sort of teenager who could not fall asleep quickly after emotional conflict, the sort of adult whose mind stayed active long after the lights were out. Or perhaps they have always had a mind that revisits, anticipates, reviews, and tries to solve in daylight. Such traits may look admirable. They can make a person conscientious, thoughtful, prepared, but the qualities that help someone navigate the day do not always help them at night. The habit of staying mentally engaged, of noticing what remains unfinished, of preparing for what comes next, may work well in a meeting, in a family crisis, in a demanding profession. Yet, in the dark, when nothing useful can be done and the body is asking for surrender, the same qualities can keep the mind from loosening its grip. This is why sleeplessness so often begins in ordinary human circumstances, but does not always end when those circumstances pass. It is not only the stressor itself that matters. It is the meeting between the stressor and the person receiving it. A difficult season lands differently in different nervous systems. Grief, work pressure, uncertainty, physical illness, hormonal change, jet lag, a new baby, a sudden disruption in routine, all of these can disturb the delicate transition into sleep. These are the precipitating moments, the first disturbances that pull rest away from its usual ease. But the deeper story depends on what happens afterward. Does the mind experience those wakeful nights as temporary weather? Or does it begin to treat them as a sign that something more fundamental has shifted? At first, most people do not ask the question so directly. They simply notice that sleep has become less smooth. The body still goes to bed at the usual time. The room is the same. The pillow is the same. Yet there is now a small hesitation where there used to be an almost invisible drift. Sleep onset takes longer. Or the person wakes in the middle of the night and has more trouble returning to sleep. Or they wake too early, before dawn, not refreshed, but already mentally upright in the daytime. They shrug it off. Everyone sleeps badly sometimes. It was a stressful week. I have a lot on my mind. Tonight will probably be better. That response is reasonable. In the early stage, it is often the healthiest one. The mind does not yet treat the disturbance as dangerous. It remains within the category of the normal. But even a normal disturbance can leave an imprint. A wakeful night is not always forgotten by morning. The person carries a faint memory of the hours spent not sleeping. They remember the feeling of lying still while darkness continued around them. They remember how unexpectedly alert they felt. They remember how long the night seemed, and how strange it was to be tired without being able to cross into rest. That memory may be mild, but it begins to color the next evening. Bedtime is no longer entirely innocent. A small thought may appear just before the lights go out. I hope it does not happen again tonight. The thought may pass quickly. It may hardly seem worth noticing. Yet it marks a subtle shift. Bedtime is no longer only the beginning of sleep. It is also the beginning of uncertainty. That uncertainty can remain modest for some time. It does not have to become panic in order to matter. The person may still sleep well on most nights. They may still think of the problem as temporary. But sleep has begun to receive more attention than before. It is no longer just happening in the background. It is being observed. A person who once simply went to bed may begin, almost without realizing it, to evaluate the conditions more carefully. Am I too keyed up tonight? Did I work too late? Was that coffee too late in the day? Did I scroll for too long? Is the room too warm? Is my mind too active? This kind of self-observation seems sensible, and sometimes it is sensible. Human beings naturally search for causes when something changes. But in the first bad nights, what begins as curiosity can also become the seed of a more complicated relationship with sleep. The mind starts leaning toward the problem. It starts checking. It starts measuring. It starts trying to determine what must be corrected. The peculiar thing about early sleeplessness is that it often remains bound to hope. The person still expects resolution. They still believe the night can be repaired by a calmer evening, a better routine, a less stressful day. They have not yet entered the deeper territory where wakefulness begins to feel chronic or inevitable. There is something almost tender about this stage. The struggle is still close to ordinary life. It still belongs to the same logic that explains so many temporary discomforts. People know what it means to be overstimulated, overtired, emotionally unsettled, out of rhythm. They assume that if they restore balance, sleep will follow. Many times, this assumption is right, but sometimes the effort to restore balance begins to change the night in ways that are not immediately visible. A person who has slept badly for a few nights may try to compensate. They may go to bed earlier, hoping to recover lost rest. They may sleep later when possible. They may cancel evening plans to protect the night ahead. They may begin assembling a more elaborate routine around bedtime. Herbal tea, a bath, a new supplement, soothing music, white noise, a different pillow, a heavier blanket, darker curtains, stricter rules about screens, stricter rules about food, stricter rules about light. None of these responses are irrational. Many of them are gentle, understandable acts of care. They come from the most basic instinct to help the body recover. But even here, something subtle begins to change. The more attention sleep receives, the more easily it can begin to feel like a task. Before that happens fully, though, there is usually a period when the person still believes the original cause is the real cause. It was the stressful project. It was the bad news. It was the change in routine. It was the illness. It was the grief. And indeed, those things matter. They matter profoundly. To deny that would flatten the whole experience into theory. A mind under strain does not become wakeful for no reason. The first bad nights are often full of meaning. They belong to real life pressing too hard against the threshold of rest. Grief makes this especially clear. A grieving person may be exhausted beyond words and still unable to sleep because loss has not only taken something from life, it has altered the whole atmosphere in which life is felt. The room seems different. Time seems different. Tomorrow seems different. Similarly, someone living through uncertainty may lie awake, not because their mind is malfunctioning, but because uncertainty gives it nothing firm to rest against. It keeps scanning because it cannot find resolution. In moments like these, the sleepless night is not simply a medical issue or a behavioral puzzle. It is part of being human in contact with change. Sleep falters because the world, or the person's place within it, no longer feels settled enough to drift away from. That is why the earliest stage of sleep trouble deserves compassion before correction. The person lying awake is often not making a mistake. Their system may simply be unwilling, for the moment, to lower its guard. The problem is that the body does not always know when the emergency has passed. Or more precisely, the state of alertness that arose for a real reason may continue after the original reason has begun to fade. The project ends, but the night remains slightly tense. The illness improves, but sleep does not fully recover. The move is complete. The box is unpacked. The breakup no longer fresh. The travel finished. The family crisis stabilized. And still, bedtime feels more watchful than it once did. That is often the first truly unsettling moment. Not the initial bad night, but the realization that the original explanation is starting to lose its power. By then, the mind has already begun collecting evidence. It remembers which nights went badly. It remembers the hours of wakefulness more vividly than the nights that passed without incident. This, too, is natural. Human attention is biased toward difficulty. What goes smoothly tends to vanish from awareness. What interrupts, threatens, or hurts tends to stay. So the person does not build a strong memory bank of ordinary nights when sleep came easily. They build a sharper memory of the exceptions. The first bad nights stand out in the mind like markers along a road that had once seemed unremarkable. Because they stand out, they begin to influence expectation. Because they influence expectation, the next nights are approached a little differently. And because that different feeling is carried into bed, sleep begins to occur in a new emotional climate. The change can be so small that it is almost unnameable. Nothing dramatic has happened. The person is not yet deeply afraid of bedtime. They do not necessarily think of themselves as someone with a sleep problem. They may even feel embarrassed to mention it. Since the trouble still seems too minor or inconsistent to deserve serious attention, but the texture of night has changed. The ordinary confidence that sleep will arrive has thinned. In its place is a mild but growing watchfulness. It may come as a thought, a bodily tension, an eagerness to see whether tonight will finally go well, or a quiet dread that it may not. The room is still. The body is tired. Everything looks outwardly normal, but underneath that surface, a new layer has formed. Sleep is no longer merely expected. It is being awaited. This is the delicate threshold where a passing disturbance can begin, very slowly, to become a pattern. The person is still close enough to ordinary sleep to remember how natural it once felt, and close enough to disruption to feel that naturalness slipping away. They have not yet fully entered the stranger territory where the bed itself begins to carry memory, effort, and anticipation, but they are moving toward it. The first bad nights do not yet constitute the whole problem. They are the opening through which the problem may enter. The season when a human response to strain can quietly begin taking on a life of its own. And that is why these nights matter so much, not because every restless period becomes chronic, and not because every stress response turns into insomnia, but because this is where the night first begins to learn that wakefulness might belong there too. There comes a point, often so quietly that it is missed at first, when the problem is no longer only the bad night itself. Something else has begun to happen beneath the surface. The room is the same room. The mattress has not changed. The blanket is the same weight it was before all this began. Nothing visible announces a new phase. And yet, bedtime now carries a feeling it did not once have. The person approaching it may still be tired, still hoping, still trying to believe that tonight will return to the old ease. But as they turn down the sheets and dim the lights, there is already a subtle change in the atmosphere. The bed is no longer only a place where sleep happens. It is becoming a place where sleep may fail. That shift matters more than it first appears. Human beings learn from repetition long before they understand what they are learning. A song can acquire sadness because it was playing during a difficult season. A street can begin to feel heavy because bad news once arrived there. A certain scent can return years later, carrying an entire forgotten mood behind it. The mind and body are always making associations, often without permission, often without language. They connect places with feelings, hours with expectations, routines with states of alertness or calm, most of the time. The bed becomes one of the safest and simplest of these associations. It gathers sleep, warmth, privacy, release. A person enters it, and the body begins, almost automatically, to let go. But repetition can teach other lessons as well, if enough nights are spent lying awake in that same place. The bed begins to absorb more than rest. It starts collecting frustration, effort, anticipation, and the peculiar strain of waiting for something that should not need to be waited for. At first, this effect is delicate. A person may not consciously fear bedtime. They may not even realize they are bracing. Yet the body can arrive with a memory the mind has not fully named. The pillow no longer means only comfort. It also means last night. It means the clock at 1:40. It means turning over again. It means trying to soften the jaw, relax the shoulders, slow the breathing, and discovering that none of these gestures quite reached the deeper part of the problem. This is one of the quieter tragedies of persistent sleeplessness. The very place designed for rest can slowly become entangled with wakefulness. The bed, which once signaled permission to disappear from the day, begins to signal uncertainty instead. And because this change happens through repeated experience rather than deliberate decision, it can feel irrational and hard to explain. A person may tell themselves there is nothing to worry about. They may know perfectly well that they are safe, that the room is quiet, that no threat is present. Yet the body does not always respond to reason alone. It responds to patterns, It learns what tends to happen here. If what has tended to happen lately is effort and waiting, then effort and waiting begin to arise more easily the moment the ritual of bedtime begins. This is why the early attempts to fix sleep can become part of the problem without the person doing anything foolish or extreme. Someone who has slept badly for several nights naturally tries to help themselves. They go to bed earlier so there will be more time for sleep. They stay in bed later to recover what was lost. They lie still even when fully awake because getting up feels like surrender. They conserve energy during the day. They begin treating the night as fragile, something that must be protected with unusual care. On the surface, these responses are gentle and logical. They come from the reasonable belief that more time in bed should create more opportunity for sleep. But the body does not always interpret them in that simple way. When a person spends long stretches awake in bed, the bed becomes a place where wakefulness is practiced. This does not mean they are choosing wakefulness. It means the nervous system is rehearsing it there, night after night. The body lies in the same posture, beneath the same covers, with the same low light or darkness around it. While the mind remains active, thoughts pass, tension returns. The clock is checked, hope rises and falls, frustration flickers, tomorrow is anticipated. The person waits for the moment of descent and does not find it. In time, the setting itself becomes linked with the state that has been repeated inside it. The bed is no longer a cue only for sleep. It has become a cue for consciousness lingering too long. There is something especially cruel about this because it inverts the logic of comfort during the day. People often long for bed as the symbol of relief. They move through meetings, traffic, chores, screens, errands, emotional labor, and think only of reaching that soft, familiar place where none of it will be required anymore. Yet for the struggling sleeper, the approach to bed can begin to produce a faint inner tightening. Not always dread, not at first. More often a subtle readiness, an alertness that feels out of proportion to the moment. The person may notice they are suddenly more awake while brushing their teeth than they were an hour earlier. They may feel a small pulse of energy when the bedside lamp clicks off. They may become unusually conscious of their own body the instant they lie down, as though the boundary between day and night has become a threshold. The mind now watches closely. This is not because the bed has become an enemy. It is because it has become meaningful. Meaning changes the body. A room in a hospital feels different from a room in a hotel, even if their dimensions are similar. A stage feels different from an empty floor. A classroom from a kitchen table. A departure gate from an ordinary chair by a window. Places acquire emotional instruction. They tell the organism, often below thought, what sort of state is likely to be needed here over time. The sleepless bed can begin giving the wrong instruction. Not sleep now, not release. Instead, something closer to pay attention. Prepare yourself. See what happens tonight. That instruction may be quiet, but quiet instructions can still shape physiology. Heart rate may remain a little higher. Muscles may never fully soften. Attention may stay close to the surface. The person feels tired, sometimes profoundly tired, but the deeper letting go does not take place. At this stage, many people become more inventive if sleep will not return naturally. Perhaps the right arrangement will coax it back. a better mattress, a colder room, lavender on the pillow, meditation tracks, weighted blankets, different positions, earplugs, white noise, brown noise, no screens, then perhaps a screen. If distraction is needed, reading until drowsy, no reading, because perhaps reading stimulates the mind. The search becomes almost tender in its sincerity. The person is not being obsessive for the sake of obsession. They are trying to restore something basic, but the accumulating adjustments can send another message to the mind. Sleep is now a project. Bedtime is now a test of whether the project will succeed. Projects belong to the waking mind. The more sleep is framed as something to achieve, the harder it can be to remain passive enough for sleep itself. A person who once climbed into bed with casual expectation now enters carrying strategies. They monitor whether the strategy is working. They compare tonight with last night. They assess whether drowsiness feels promising or false. Even the good signs can become destabilizing. If they begin to feel a little sleepy, they may think, "Good, finally, do not lose it." And in the moment of protecting that fragile state, attention sharpens again. The mind leans forward. Sleep, which depends on the fading of such effort, retreats. None of this has to be dramatic in order to be powerful. The conditioning of sleeplessness is often built from small repetitions, not major crises. 10 extra minutes awake in bed, then 40, then an hour, then an early bedtime meant kindly, followed by more hours spent half resting, half waiting. A weekend attempt to catch up by lingering in bed long after waking. A night spent trying not to move because movement might admit defeat. A morning of exhaustion that seems to confirm the seriousness of the problem. Each piece by itself looks harmless or even sensible. Together, they create a pattern in which the bed becomes one of the central stages on which wakefulness performs. The person often feels this change before they understand it. They may say things like, "I get sleepy in the living room, but wake up as soon as I go to bed." Or, "I can barely keep my eyes open until I lie down. And then suddenly I am awake again." Such experiences can feel absurd, even mocking, but they reveal something important. Sleepiness is not just a quantity that rises steadily until sleep must occur. It is also shaped by context. If the context has learned to evoke alertness, then the transition into bed can interrupt the very state the person has been hoping to preserve. The body was tired on the sofa. It may still be tired under the covers, but a different layer of the system has now become active. This is where shame often begins to enter, because the person starts to feel trapped inside behavior that no longer makes sense to them. They know, at some level, that the bed ought to be restful. They know that lying there hour after hour is not helping. They may even hear advice telling them not to stay awake in bed, not to struggle there, not to let the space fill with frustration. But in the middle of the night, such advice is difficult to follow. The bed is warm. The house is dark. Getting up feels unnatural. Remaining there feels miserable. The person hovers between two unsatisfying choices, both of which now belong to the same problem. That helplessness deepens the emotional charge of the space. The bed is no longer neutral. It has become loaded with repeated unsuccessful attempts to recover what once came freely. And yet this learning is not proof of damage. That is an important distinction. The bed learns wakefulness in the same way anything is learned through association. It is not a moral failure. It is not evidence that the mind has become permanently disordered. It is a sign that the nervous system has started linking one thing with another through repeated experience. This should be understood with some gentleness, because the very sensitivity that creates the problem also means the pattern can, in time, be changed. But before it can be changed, it has to be seen clearly. The person has to understand that the night is no longer being shaped only by the original stressor. The setting itself has entered the story. Once that happens, bedtime acquires a memory of its own, even on evenings when the day has gone reasonably well, even on nights when the person feels almost hopeful again. The approach to bed can stir an old readiness. The body does not wait for disaster. It remembers form. It remembers the long period of lying awake, the desire for sleep, the failed descent, the checking, the trying. That remembered form is enough to begin arousing the system before any obvious thought appears. Then, when thought does appear, it finds fertile ground already prepared for it. This is why the problem so often deepens in silence. The person may look calm from the outside. They may go through the same evening routine, switch off the same lamp, settle under the same blanket, but internally, something has already tilted. The room now holds expectation. The bed holds memory. The body holds the outline of previous nights. And into that atmosphere, the mind begins to arrive. Not as a simple passenger, but as an increasingly attentive observer of whether sleep will come, how long it will take, what each sensation means, and what tomorrow will cost if the night fails once more. By then, wakefulness is no longer only occurring in the bed. It is being watched there, and that is where the next transformation begins. Because once the bed has learned wakefulness, the mind begins learning an even more exhausting role. It begins to stand guard over the whole process. Once the bed has stopped feeling entirely innocent, the mind rarely remains passive for long. It begins to watch, not always dramatically, not in the fevered way people sometimes imagine when they think of insomnia. More often, the watchfulness is quiet, disciplined, almost reasonable in tone. A person lies in the dark and notices that sleep has not yet arrived. Then they notice that they are noticing. They tell themselves not to worry. They adjust the pillow. They close their eyes more firmly, as if sleep might be waiting just behind the next small act of cooperation. For a few moments, the effort seems calm enough to escape attention. But beneath it, something essential has changed. The mind is no longer simply present during the night. It has taken up a role. It has become a kind of watchman. The word matters because a watchman does not sleep easily. A watchman listens for changes. A watchman keeps track of what has and has not happened. A watchman compares the present moment to what should have occurred by now. This is why the sleepless mind so often feels both tired and strangely alert. It is not bursting with energy in any joyful sense. It is weary, irritated, fogged by fatigue. But inside that tiredness is a narrow beam of attention that refuses to dissolve. Something in the mind has decided, however subtly, that the night requires supervision. At first, The object of supervision may seem harmless. The person checks whether they are getting sleepier. They wonder whether their breathing is too shallow. They ask themselves whether the room is too warm, whether the blanket is too heavy, whether they should change position, whether they are trying too hard, whether trying not to try has now become another form of trying. None of this has to feel panicked in order to be activating. It is enough that awareness has begun circling around the process itself. Sleep does not thrive under inspection. That is one of the crueler facts a sleepless person discovers. During the day, attention often helps. If a task matters, one concentrates. If something is wrong, one studies it more carefully. If a result is needed, one monitors progress. This logic has been rewarded so many times in waking life that it can feel almost irresponsible not to apply it to the night as well. But the mind that starts supervising sleep often becomes the very thing that keeps sleep from arriving. It turns the night into a problem space. It places consciousness at the center of an event that normally requires consciousness to recede. This is why a sleepless person can become exhausted by thoughts that are not, on the surface, especially dramatic. The mind does not need to fill itself with catastrophe. It can remain awake through far smaller acts of management. A person may simply begin timing the interval. Has it been 20 minutes? Has it been an hour? Was I closer to sleep before I rolled over? Did that thought wake me up again? Am I drifting or only pretending to drift? These are not grand existential crises. They are modest questions, but modest questions repeated in darkness can create a powerful form of vigilance. The clock becomes one of the Watchman's most dangerous tools. Few objects in modern life are as ordinary as a digital bedside clock, and few can become as emotionally charged during a wakeful night. A person may tell themselves they will not look. They may know perfectly well that checking the time usually makes things worse. Yet some part of the mind still wants the measurement. It wants to know how bad the night is becoming. It wants to calculate what remains. Midnight, 1:30, 3:15, 4:10. The glowing numbers do more than mark time. They convert uncertainty into consequence. There are now 4 hours left before morning, now 3.5, now less. And with each calculation, the Watchman grows more convinced that its work is necessary. How could the mind stop monitoring after receiving such information? The numbers seem to demand response. They invite prediction. Tomorrow will be difficult. The meeting will feel impossible. I will be useless by afternoon. I will not cope well. I must sleep soon. The night becomes a narrowing corridor, and inside it, the mind starts guarding against the future as much as against the present. It is easy, from the outside, to dismiss these thoughts as unhelpful. And of course, they are unhelpful. But that is not the same as irrational. The Watchman is trying to do something recognizably human. It is trying to prepare. It is trying to reduce uncertainty by staying alert to signs, timings, and consequences in daylight. This kind of foresight often looks responsible. At night, when no useful action is possible, the same impulse becomes trapped. It can neither solve the problem nor release it, so it remains in place, working without resolution. That is one reason sleeplessness can feel so mentally crowded, even in an otherwise silent room. The body is not only deprived of sleep, it is occupied by an ongoing act of internal administration. the mind checks symptoms. It reviews the day. It rehearses tomorrow. It notices the heartbeat, then notices that it is noticing the heartbeat. It scans for drowsiness, then becomes alarmed by the absence of drowsiness. It recalls previous bad nights and uses them as evidence. It tries to calm itself and then evaluates whether the calming is working. Each layer creates another layer above it. The result is a peculiar kind of consciousness, one that feels both narrowed and overfull. Many people assume that a wakeful mind at night must be racing in the obvious sense, producing one dramatic thought after another. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes the night is filled with anxiety so clear and forceful that there is no mystery about why sleep has fled. But very often, the sleepless mind is quieter than that. Its problem is not only speed, its problem is stance. It is standing guard. It is turned toward the night with too much interest, too much evaluative attention, too much concern about whether sleep is progressing correctly. That stance can latch onto almost anything. For one person, it latches onto the body. Why is my heart beating so loudly? Why do I feel warm? Why do my legs feel restless? Why does my jaw keep tightening? Ordinary bodily sensations, which would normally fade into the background on the way to sleep, become foregrounded under observation. Once they are foregrounded, they start feeling more significant. Once they feel more significant, the mind devotes more attention to them. The loop closes quietly and efficiently. For another person, the watchman latches onto thought itself. Why am I still thinking? Why can I not turn my brain off? Why does this conversation from earlier keep returning? Why am I thinking about something so trivial? Here too, the content matters less than the relationship to it. Thoughts do not merely pass through consciousness. They are evaluated as evidence of failed sleep. A memory appears and is treated as a problem. A plan for tomorrow appears and is treated as proof that the mind is too active. Even annoyance at one's own thinking becomes another source of arousal. For others, the watchman becomes morale. It asks what kind of person cannot perform this most basic act. Why can everyone else sleep and not me? Why am I making such a mess of something natural? Have I broken something in myself? Am I too anxious, too weak, too dependent on routine, too sensitive, too fragile? These thoughts carry a special sting because they turn the night into a verdict. It is no longer only a difficult experience. It becomes a judgment on character and shame. Once introduced into the bedroom, is not a quiet companion. Yet the watchman does not arise because the person is vain or defective. It arises because the mind has started treating wakefulness as meaningful. The bad nights have accumulated. The bed has gathered memory. Tomorrow has become part of the night under those conditions. Attention naturally moves toward the thing that seems to matter most. The mind does what it has always done when something appears important. It allocates resources. It observes carefully. It refuses to disengage. In almost any other setting, this would be called vigilance. In bed, it becomes a trap. One of the most painful features of this trap is that the watchman often believes it is helping. It believes that if it keeps careful enough track, the night can still be managed. If it catches the problem early, perhaps it can fix it. If it monitors the body precisely enough, perhaps the right adjustment will appear. If it stays ahead of tomorrow's fatigue, perhaps the damage can be limited. if it remains mentally present. Perhaps it can somehow guide the body towards sleep. But the very posture of guidance keeps the system too engaged for the descent it seeks. The watchman guards the threshold and, by guarding it, blocks passage through it. This is why people often report the strange sensation of becoming more awake the more urgently they want to sleep. The desire itself is not the issue. The body can sincerely need rest. The problem is what desire turns into once the mind begins managing it. Wanting sleep becomes trying for sleep. Trying becomes monitoring. Monitoring becomes vigilance. Vigilance becomes arousal. And arousal, even in a subtle form, is almost the opposite of the state sleep requires. The mind, meanwhile, interprets this failure as evidence that it must remain even more alert. It starts listening for the wrong things, not the soft blurring that precedes sleep, but signs of not sleeping, not the natural dimming of attention, but interruptions in that dimming. It begins to treat wakefulness as the central event of the night, and sleep as the uncertain outcome. That reversal is small in grammar and immense in experience. When a person once lay down expecting sleep and occasionally met wakefulness, now they lie down braced for wakefulness and hoping to be surprised by sleep. The watchman has rearranged the emotional order of the room. In some people, this inner stance becomes so practiced that it appears before any obvious thought does. They do not have to tell themselves to worry. They do not even have to think explicitly about tomorrow. The body arrives in bed, and a faint state of alertness is already there. Like a muscle prepared before movement begins. Then thought catches up afterward. The mind notices the alertness, asks why it is present, and starts generating explanations. But the shift began earlier, deeper, in the layer where learned expectation and physiological readiness meet. That is part of what makes insomnia feel so involuntary. People are often told to calm down, stop thinking, worry less, let it go. Such advice is not entirely wrong, but it can miss the lived reality of what is happening. The person is not simply choosing thoughts the way one chooses a song. They are caught in a system where attention has become conditioned, where the mind has learned that night is a place requiring supervision. By the time a conscious thought appears, much of the posture that produced it is already in place. This also explains why purely comforting reassurances can fail in the middle of the night. A person may know, in daylight, that one poor night is survivable. They may know that fatigue is unpleasant, but not catastrophic. They may know that many people sleep badly sometimes and continue living their lives. Yet at 2:43 in the morning, knowledge often loses some of its force. The watchman is not reasoning from broad perspective. It is working under narrowed attention, inside darkness. With a clock nearby and tomorrow approaching, its logic becomes immediate. Sleep now matters more than anything else. Failure now feels larger than it will look in daylight. The mind becomes temporarily convinced that its alertness is justified by necessity. And because the watchman has taken control, even the quietest nights can feel crowded. A person may lie perfectly still. They may make no sound at all. The room may appear peaceful enough that another sleeper beside them has no idea a struggle is unfolding inches away. Yet, inwardly, an entire drama of observation is underway. Time is being measured. Sensations are being interpreted. Consequences are being imagined. Efforts are being made and evaluated. This is why insomnia can be so exhausting even before morning arrives. The mind has been working the whole night, not usefully, not productively, but intensely enough to prevent true rest. Eventually, the person begins to understand, however vaguely, that the problem is no longer just sleeplessness, it is vigilance itself. The mind has become an instrument tuned too finely to the absence of sleep. It notices too much, interprets too quickly, prepares too eagerly, and lingers too near the controls of a process that cannot be run by hand. Once that becomes the central pattern, the night is no longer governed only by thought content. It is governed by a broader condition of activation, and that realization opens the story further. Because even when the mind has become a watchman, psychology alone is not the whole explanation. Beneath the thoughts, beneath the monitoring, beneath the learned readiness of the night, other forces are still at work. The body keeps time in ways the watchman barely understands. Tiredness rises and falls. Alertness follows deeper rhythms. And to understand why exhaustion still fails to guarantee sleep, we have to move below the level of thought and into the clocks that have been shaping the night all along. By the time a person begins to understand that the night has become watchful, it is tempting to explain everything through psychology alone. The mind is too active, the thoughts are too loud, the body is too tense. The problem seems to live entirely in worry, memory, expectation, and effort. And certainly those things matter. They matter deeply, but if the story ended there, it would remain too small. The sleepless night is not only a drama of thought, it is also a drama of timing. Beneath the visible struggle, the body is keeping time in ways that most people rarely notice until sleep stops arriving as expected. It does not simply grow tired in a straight line and then shut down when exhaustion becomes strong enough. Human sleep is shaped by deeper rhythms, overlapping pressures, and internal clocks that do not always obey desire. This is one reason the experience can feel so bewildering. A person may be tired enough to crave rest and still find that the system beneath the craving has not aligned itself to allow sleep easily. The simplest version of the mystery sounds almost childish. If I am tired, why can I not sleep? But the body does not treat tiredness as a single thing. What most people call being tired often includes several different states folded together. There is the heaviness that comes from too much effort. There is the mental dullness that follows stress or overstimulation. There is emotional fatigue, the feeling of having carried too much inwardly. There is the aching weariness of too little rest across many days. And somewhere within all of that is sleepiness itself, the specific biological movement towards sleep. These states often overlap, which is why they are so easily confused. A person can be worn out by life and not yet truly ready for sleep. They can feel depleted, irritated, foggy, and still remain oddly alert when bedtime arrives. The mistake is understandable because exhaustion feels as though it should be enough in ordinary language. Being tired and being sleepy seem almost interchangeable. But the night teaches otherwise. The body can be drained while the systems that govern sleep remain mistimed, overstimulated, or out of step with the hour the person has chosen for bed. To understand this, it helps to imagine that sleep is shaped by two broad forces moving together: though not always peacefully. One is the pressure that builds across the day. The longer a person remains awake, the more the body accumulates the need for sleep. Wakefulness creates a kind of debt, though not in the moral sense people sometimes talk about. It is simply a biological pressure that grows with time spent awake. This pressure makes late night feel different from late morning. It is why, after enough hours of consciousness, the eyes grow heavy, concentration weakens, and the body begins leaning toward rest. This is the part people usually trust. I have been awake a long time. Therefore, I should be able to sleep. And yet another force is moving at the same time. The body also runs on an internal schedule, a rhythmic pattern of alertness and sleepiness that does not depend only on how long one has been awake. This inner timing system helps determine when sleep is most likely to come, when alertness tends to rise, when the body expects darkness, and when it expects light. It shapes hormone release, body temperature, mental sharpness, and the subtle daily arc of energy. Most people notice it only in fragments. The afternoon dip, the second wind late at night, the strange clarity that can appear when one stays awake too long, the difficulty of falling asleep too early, even when exhausted, the stubborn wakefulness that arrives in a hotel room after crossing time zones. These are not failures of character. They are evidence that the body is not governed by tiredness alone. So, the sleepless person is often caught between two truths. The pressure for sleep may indeed be present. They may genuinely need rest. But the clock beneath that need may not be aligning with their intention in the way they expect. This misalignment can happen for obvious reasons, like shift work, travel, irregular sleep schedules, or long evenings flooded with bright light and stimulation. But it can also happen more subtly, inside lives that outwardly appear ordinary. A person may feel sleepy on the sofa at 9:30, then decide to get ready for bed, only to find that by the time the ritual is complete, sleepiness has thinned and a more alert state has returned. Someone else may drag themselves through the day and still feel strangely awake at midnight, not because they are not tired, but because some deeper rhythm is still holding them on the waking side of the threshold. Another person may fall asleep easily, then wake at 3 in the morning and discover that the body is no longer willing to stay under. The problem, in each case, is not identical, but the common lesson is the same. The night is being shaped by timing as well as by thought. This is why the notion of a simple off switch is so misleading. People often imagine sleep as the natural consequence of shutting things down. Turn off the lights, turn off the screens, turn off the noise, turn off the mind. But the body is not a machine waiting for a single command. It is closer to an orchestra whose sections must enter at the right moment. Sleep comes most easily when pressure and timing converge. When they do not, a person can feel trapped in a contradictory state, too exhausted to feel well, too alert to fall asleep cleanly. The body wants rest, but not under the conditions currently present. The mind, meanwhile, interprets this conflict as more evidence that something is wrong. That interpretation is understandable. The mismatch feels unnatural when one is living inside it. A person thinks, I did everything right, I am tired, the room is dark. Why is my body refusing the obvious? But from the body's point of view, nothing obvious is happening. It is responding to layered signals. Time awake, light exposure, routine, previous sleep, stress chemistry, habit, expectation, recent nights. internal rhythm. All of these have a say. Modern life has not made this easier. For most of human history, the boundaries between day and night were sharper than they are now. Darkness arrived with greater authority. Work, social contact, entertainment, and information had more natural stopping points. This does not mean people in the past slept perfectly. They did not. Human beings have always worried, grieved, watched the sick, endured uncertainty, lain awake under the pressure of memory or fear. But contemporary life has created new ways of drifting out of rhythm with the body's quieter timing. Light follows us indoors. Conversation follows us through messages. Work remains unfinished in glowing tabs. News arrives without respecting the hour. Screens keep the eyes engaged and the mind half participating in worlds that never fully close. Evening no longer fades so much as it gets extended. For some people, this extension feels natural. They become more alive at night, more focused, more inwardly clear. The late hours seem to open rather than close. Creativity appears. Thought deepens. Privacy expands. The world quiets enough to think in. Such people may not be doing anything wrong. They may simply have an internal rhythm that leans later than the life around them allows. But tension arises when social schedules demand sleep before the body is prepared to enter it. A person may be expected to rest at 10 because morning begins early, even while some part of their system is still holding to wakefulness, as though the night has not fully matured. This can create one of the most frustrating experiences in adult life. The person is tired enough to resent being awake, and yet not aligned enough to sleep. They lie in bed feeling both spent and unconvinced, as if the body has not fully accepted the bargain. The mind, already trained by previous nights to pay close attention, notices the mismatch immediately. It becomes concerned. It begins supervising again. And now the biological tension is joined by psychological tension, each one making the other harder to soften. It is also important to understand that the body does not read missed sleep in the sentimental way people often do. If someone spends more time in bed trying to catch up, the system does not necessarily translate that into more sleep. If naps creep too long into the late afternoon, if bedtime shifts earlier out of desperation, if morning wake time becomes irregular, the very structure that was meant to rescue sleep can weaken the pressure that would have helped sleep later. The person feels they are being sensible. They are trying to recover. But the body is still keeping its own account of time awake and time in bed. This is one reason the sleepless night can become so confusing. The person is trying harder while the underlying biology is quietly moving in another direction. Then there is the strange fact that wakefulness itself can sometimes generate its own counterfeit energy. Anyone who has stayed awake too long knows this feeling. Instead of fading into gentle sleepiness, the mind can become brittle, sharp, overstimulated, almost feverishly present. Thoughts come more quickly, not less. Small worries grow louder. The body feels both exhausted and tense. This does not mean the person has suddenly become rested. It means the system, under pressure, has shifted into a more activated state. Fatigue is still there, but it is no longer simple. It has been mixed with arousal. That mixture is especially punishing at night because it confuses intuition. The person expects increasing tiredness to lead in a straight line towards sleep. Instead, the later it gets, The stranger consciousness can feel. There may be moments of heavy drowsiness followed by renewed alertness. There may be periods when the body seems on the edge of sleep, only to rebound into thought. There may be hours in which time feels both slow and unstable, as though the usual progression from wakefulness into rest has broken apart into fragments. And all the while, the inner clocks continue their work. The body temperature changes across the night. Hormonal signals rise and fall. Alertness has its own tides. Light in the evening can nudge the system one way. Early morning light can nudge it another. Routine matters. Consistency matters. But even within a well-structured life, the body remains something more intricate than a schedule. It is a living pattern, full of rhythms that can be shaped, disrupted, strengthened, confused, or slowly retrained. For the struggling sleeper, this complexity can be both discouraging and strangely relieving. Discouraging, because it means there is no single button to press. One cannot simply demand that the mind stop watching and the body immediately comply. The problem is larger than thought alone, but relieving as well, because it means the sleepless night is not proof of weakness or lack of discipline. There are systems beneath awareness. There are forces deeper than intention. The person is not failing at a basic task in the childish sense. They are living inside a body whose timing, pressure, and learned patterns have drifted out of ease with one another. This is also why the night can feel so different from day in, the way it reveals the self. During the day, a person can often override mistiming with movement. Coffee, conversation, obligation, noise. The rhythm may be off, but life continues to impose structure. At night, there is less to cover the misalignment. The person meets it directly. They feel the gap between wanting sleep and being able to enter it. They feel the hour moving past. They feel the body asking for rest without fully yielding to it. And because they feel this so personally, they often miss how impersonal some of it really is. The clocks beneath the night are not moral. They are rhythmic. They do not care how badly a person wants tomorrow to go well. They do not respond to pleading. They respond to timing, pattern, light, habit, pressure, and state. Yet even this impersonal quality becomes deeply personal in experience. A person begins to fear certain hours. Midnight, 2 a.m, dawn. They begin to interpret the body's rhythms not as natural fluctuations, but as verdicts. If sleep has not come by now, the night is lost. If I wake at this hour, tomorrow will be ruined. If I am sleepy too early, I must preserve it carefully. If I am not sleepy enough, something is wrong. Biological timing becomes translated into emotional consequence. The clock in the body and the clock on the nightstand start feeding each other, until time itself feels hostile. This is why an explanation based only on thoughts is never quite enough. The watchman of the mind is real, but the watchman is standing on deeper ground. Beneath it are rhythms, pressures, internal phases of alertness and release. Some nights the system is mistimed. Some nights it is overstimulated. Some nights it is reacting to accumulated sleep loss in ways that make consciousness feel harsher rather than softer. And often, these biological realities become inseparable from the meanings the person has attached to them. By this point, the problem has expanded far beyond bedtime. The night is no longer only a place where sleep is difficult. It has become a place where the body's timing, the mind's vigilance, and the memory of previous struggle meet in a single experience. And what happens there does not stay there. It moves into the day. The fatigue, the dread, the irritability, the strange effort of functioning after broken rest. Slowly, the day begins carrying the night inside it, and the fear of the coming night begins haunting the hours meant for waking. At first, a bad night seems confined to the dark. It happens in bed, behind closed curtains, in hours when most of the world is absent. The struggle feels private and strangely sealed off from daylight. Morning comes, the alarm sounds, and a person rises with the hope that the night, however uncomfortable, will remain where it happened. But poor sleep does not stay neatly in its place. It travels forward. It enters the next morning before the person has fully opened their eyes. It changes the texture of ordinary tasks. It bends attention, mood, patience, memory, appetite, and effort. A wakeful night may end at dawn, but its consequences do not. The first sign is often not dramatic sleepiness in the way people imagine it. It is not always a simple urge to close the eyes and drift off at the breakfast table. More often, it is a duller and more complex state. The body feels heavy, but not peaceful. The mind feels used up, but not quiet. Thoughts take more effort to organize. Small tasks seem to require disproportionate energy. Irritation rises faster. Noise feels harsher. A person who slept badly may move through the day feeling not only tired, but strained, as though the whole organism is functioning with less margin than usual. This matters because people often expect the consequences of poor sleep to be straightforward. If I sleep badly, I will simply feel sleepy. But the lived reality is often more confusing than that. A person may feel exhausted and yet also tense. They may yawn repeatedly and still find it impossible to relax. They may struggle to focus, but not in a gentle, foggy way. Instead, there is a frayed quality to attention. A sense that the mind keeps slipping off the task and then scolding itself for doing so. This is one reason poor sleep can feel so demoralizing. It does not only remove energy, it also makes self-possession harder to maintain. As the day continues, the person begins to assess the damage. They notice how much harder simple things have become. A familiar commute feels longer. Emails take more concentration to answer. Words do not arrive as cleanly in conversation. Patience with other people thins. Small frustrations carry more force than they deserve. If the person is already prone to self-monitoring, they begin watching themselves for signs of decline. Am I thinking clearly? Did I just forget what I was about to say? Why does everything feel slightly unreal? Will people notice that I am off by late afternoon? The day is no longer simply being lived. It is being measured against the night that came before it. This is one of the ways insomnia expands beyond sleep itself. It creates a second layer of experience in which the person becomes increasingly occupied, not only by fatigue, but by the meaning of fatigue. The bad night becomes an explanation for every stumble. The missed word in a meeting, the slower reaction, the change in mood, the desire to cancel plans, the sense of not being fully present in one's own life. All of it begins to gather under a single heading. I am like this because I did not sleep. That interpretation is often partly true. But once it becomes habitual, The day starts feeding the night with a kind of anticipatory logic. If daytime impairment feels large enough, then the next night begins carrying greater stakes. Tomorrow starts entering bedtime long before bedtime arrives. A person may begin the afternoon already thinking about how important it is to sleep tonight. They may feel the pressure build as evening approaches, not always in a loud or panicked way. Sometimes it is just a steady awareness in the background. I really need tonight to go well. I cannot do another day like this. I have to function tomorrow. The more exhausted the person feels, the more reasonable these thoughts seem. They do not appear irrational. They appear necessary. But necessity can be activating. It transforms the coming night from an ordinary biological event into a test with consequences. That pressure changes evening itself. What used to be a natural slide out of the day begins to feel more strategic. The person protects the coming night. They may become unusually careful with food, screens, light, noise, timing, conversation, even emotion. If something upsetting happens in the evening, it feels not merely upsetting but dangerous because it may damage sleep. If dinner runs late, or work continues too long, or a message arrives carrying stress, the person may feel a jolt of alarm out of proportion to the event itself. The reason is no longer just the event. It is what the event might do to the night, and what the night might do to tomorrow. By now, the day and the night have begun forming a loop. The night creates fatigue, mental strain, and dread. The day reacts to those states with monitoring, frustration, and urgency. Then evening arrives, carrying that urgency back toward bed. The person does not come to the night empty anymore. They come carrying the memory of how badly yesterday felt. They come carrying the need not to repeat it. And because that need sharpens attention, the mind enters the night less able to soften. The day begins haunting the night, not through drama, but through accumulation. There is also a quieter cruelty in the way poor sleep affects mood. A person may feel more fragile than usual without fully understanding why. A casual remark lands harder. A minor disappointment feels strangely heavy. Tasks that would ordinarily seem manageable begin to feel burdensome before they have even started. The person may become less tolerant of uncertainty, less able to absorb inconvenience, less willing to trust that things will be fine. This emotional thinning matters because it changes the meaning of the coming night. If daylight itself feels less manageable, then sleep begins to feel more essential, more urgent, more loaded with responsibility. It is no longer simply rest. It becomes the condition under which tomorrow may or may not be survivable. For some people, this is where fear starts becoming specific. They do not merely dislike sleeplessness. They begin to fear what poor sleep will do to their functioning, personality, relationships, competence, even identity. They may wonder whether they are becoming someone less capable, less stable, less themselves. Will I be patient with my children tomorrow? Will I be sharp enough for that meeting? Will I drive safely? Will I say something foolish? Will I be able to think? These questions can become especially forceful in high-responsibility lives, where even modest cognitive dulling feels costly. The mind, trying to protect the future, begins rehearsing it in increasingly vigilant ways. That rehearsal can continue even when the person is outwardly performing well. This is important because sleepless people are often not as visibly impaired as they feel. Many continue working, caregiving, commuting, speaking, deciding, and maintaining the outward shape of life. To others, they may appear tired but functional, yet inwardly, the experience can feel much more catastrophic. The effort required to appear normal becomes part of the burden. The person thinks, "I am holding it together," but only barely. And because they are measuring the day from the inside, through strain rather than appearance, the night ahead gathers even more emotional charge. Sometimes there is also a mismatch between how much a person feels they have slept and how much they objectively did sleep. This is one of the stranger features of chronic sleep difficulty. A person may feel as though they were awake almost the entire night, even when some fragments of sleep did occur. They remember the wakefulness vividly, because wakefulness carries consciousness with it. Sleep, especially broken or shallow-feeling sleep, leaves a weaker memory trace. The result can be a painful kind of uncertainty. Did I sleep at all? Was I awake the whole time? Why do I feel as if I never crossed over? This uncertainty often intensifies the next day's anxiety because the person is not only tired, they are also deprived of a clear narrative of what happened in the night. The mind dislikes that ambiguity. It wants numbers. It wants certainty. It wants to know how much damage has been done, so the person may begin estimating, counting, reconstructing the night from fragments. I was awake at midnight. I remember looking at the clock at 2. I must have slept for a little while before 4. Perhaps only 3 hours total. Perhaps less. These calculations rarely comfort. They make the night more measurable, and therefore more consequential. Once the day is organized around such arithmetic, the next bedtime is approached with the memory not only of fatigue, but of quantified loss. There is a deep irony here. The more a person tries to understand the day after poor sleep, the more material the mind gathers to fear the next night. A difficult morning confirms the seriousness of insomnia. A clumsy conversation confirms its social cost. Afternoon exhaustion confirms its reach. Evening dread confirms its emotional power. Each bad day becomes evidence that sleep must happen tonight. And that evidence increases the very alertness that makes sleep harder to enter. The day, in other words, becomes part of the disorder's machinery. It supplies the emotional fuel that the night then burns. This is why insomnia is better understood as a full cycle than as a single nighttime event. What begins in the dark spreads across the waking hours. Fatigue alters attention. Altered attention increases self-monitoring. Self-monitoring magnifies errors, discomfort, and fear. Fear increases the perceived importance of sleep. The perceived importance of sleep sharpens vigilance at bedtime. Vigilance interferes with sleep. The next day begins under the shadow of the night before, and the cycle starts again. None of this requires melodrama. It can happen inside very ordinary lives, quietly, while a person continues paying bills, answering messages, making meals, attending meetings, and appearing, to most observers, more or less fine. That ordinariness is part of the suffering. If the problem were spectacular, others might understand it more easily. But poor sleep often produces a private erosion rather than a public collapse. The person becomes increasingly preoccupied with something others cannot fully see. They may hesitate to talk about it because it sounds too common to deserve attention. Everyone gets tired. Everyone has bad nights. Everyone says they are exhausted. But the person living inside chronic wakefulness knows that this is something more structured than ordinary tiredness. It is not just fatigue. It is the gradual colonizing of the day by the memory and anticipation of the night. As this continues, even neutral parts of the day can become linked to the coming struggle. Late afternoon may bring a sinking feeling because evening is approaching. Sunset may stop feeling peaceful and start feeling like the beginning of an exam. The act of making dinner, washing up, dimming lights, changing clothes, all of it can acquire the emotional tone of preparation for something uncertain. The person may still long for bed physically, but psychologically they approach it with a mixture of hope and apprehension. That mixture is tiring in its own right. It means that the evening no longer restores. It gathers tension. Sometimes the person responds by trying to protect themselves from disappointment. They lower expectations. They tell themselves not to hope too much for sleep tonight. They brace for another hard morning in advance. This can look like realism, and sometimes it is realism. But it also reveals how deeply the night has spread into the day. Even before the lights are off, the person is already organizing emotionally around possible failure. Bedtime is no longer the simple beginning of rest. It is the point where the next day's mood, confidence, and functioning seem to be put at risk again. And still, because the body is exhausted, the person often assumes that another bad night will finally force sleep the next one. This belief is understandable. Surely enough fatigue must eventually override the whole system. Surely the body cannot remain trapped forever in this cycle of tiredness without release. Sometimes accumulated sleep pressure does help, but often the person discovers that sheer exhaustion is not enough to guarantee restful sleep when fear, timing, vigilance, and conditioned wakefulness are already in place. Then the demoralization deepens. If even this level of fatigue does not solve it, what will... That question has a way of hardening into desperation. By this stage, the person may feel that the day has become built around managing the consequences of the night, and the night built around preventing the damage of the day. Life narrows, spontaneity fades, plans are weighed against possible sleep disruption. Emotional energy is consumed not only by being tired, but by trying to contain what tiredness might do. The person begins to live inside a self-protective system that seems sensible from moment to moment, and yet keeps reproducing the very thing it fears. This is the point where many people begin searching more seriously for a way out. Not a trick, not a gentle preference or a wellness habit added around the edges, something more fundamental, because by now it is becoming clear that the ordinary responses have not broken the cycle. Trying harder to secure sleep has not brought peace. Protecting the night has not made the night less loaded. Monitoring the day has not reduced the fear of tomorrow. The logic that seems most natural: control more, prepare more, optimize more, has only woven the problem more tightly into daily life. And that is what makes the next step feel so strange when it finally comes into view. The way forward does not begin with greater mastery. It begins with understanding why the struggle itself has become part of the system, and why rest often returns not when the person learns to control sleep more perfectly, but when they begin, carefully and against instinct, to loosen their grip on it. By the time a person reaches this stage, they are often ready for a solution that feels stronger, more precise, and more controlling. That is only natural. When the night has spread into the day, when fatigue has begun shaping mood, confidence, work, relationships, and the emotional tone of evening itself, the desire for mastery becomes intense. People want a method that will restore order. They want the missing lever, the right supplement, the perfect routine, the final rule that will make sleep happen again. After all, the problem has become so consuming that it seems to demand a proportionate response. If the nights are this difficult, then the answer must be equally forceful. And yet one of the strangest discoveries in modern sleep treatment is that the way out often begins by stepping back from the very struggle that feels most justified. This is deeply counterintuitive. Almost everything about ordinary life teaches people that difficult outcomes require increased effort. If health falters, one becomes more disciplined. If work slips, one concentrates harder. If a relationship is strained, one tries to communicate more carefully. These instincts are not wrong. They are often the foundation of competence. But insomnia exposes a limit in that logic. Sleep is one of the rare human experiences that resists direct control. The harder one grips it, the more elusive it can become. The tighter the supervision, the more active the nervous system remains. The more important sleep becomes in the moment, the less hospitable the moment can be to sleep itself. That is why real treatment can sound almost absurd when first encountered. The person who has spent weeks or months trying to protect sleep is suddenly told that some of their most reasonable instincts may be strengthening the problem. Spending more time in bed may not be helping. Lying there awake for long stretches may be teaching the bed the wrong lesson. Monitoring the body for signs of drowsiness may be intensifying alertness. Trying to force calm may be another form of effort. Even the heartfelt determination to sleep well tonight may be part of what keeps the mind too engaged to let the night unfold naturally. This does not mean effort is useless. It means effort has to change shape. The goal is no longer to make sleep happen by force. The goal is to stop feeding the system that has turned sleep into a performance. That shift may be the most important reversal in the whole documentary, because it changes the story from one of personal failure to one of learned patterns. The person is not told, sleep better. They are shown why the struggle itself has become organized around the wrong target. Sleep has been treated as something to produce moment by moment, when in fact it returns more readily when the conditions around it are altered and the watchfulness surrounding it is weakened. For many people, this feels like relief mixed with resistance. Relief, because it offers a new interpretation of the problem. Resistance, because it asks them to loosen the very habits that have seemed protective. A person who has become afraid of bad nights does not easily surrender their strategies. They have gone to bed early because they were desperate for more rest. They have stayed in bed because the body felt too tired to leave it. They have monitored sleep because tomorrow seemed too important not to. They have built rules and rituals because uncertainty felt unbearable. To hear that these responses may need to be softened can sound almost insulting at first, as though the treatment does not appreciate how hard the nights have been. But good treatment does appreciate it. It begins there. It recognizes that these habits were not foolish. They were understandable responses to distress. The problem is not that the person cared too much about sleep in any moral sense. The problem is that the caring became organized around constant management, and constant management kept the system too activated. So treatment begins by changing the relationship between the person, the bed, and the night. One of the most important ideas is deceptively simple. The bed must become a place strongly linked with sleep again, rather than with prolonged wakefulness, frustration, and waiting. This principle can feel almost too modest to matter, but it is profound. If the bed has learned wakefulness through repetition, then the bed must relearn sleep through repetition as well. That means reducing the amount of time spent lying awake there. It means protecting the connection between bed and sleep rather than between bed and struggle. For someone who has been exhausted for a long time, this can feel backward. Why spend less time in bed when the whole problem is not getting enough sleep? Why get up when tired? Why not stay still and hope the body eventually yields? Yet this is where the deeper logic appears. More time in bed is not always more sleep. Sometimes it is simply more wakefulness in bed, which weakens the pressure for sleep and strengthens the association between the bed and alertness. By tightening the window of time devoted to actual sleep, treatment can increase the body's drive to sleep more solidly and reduce the long gray hours in which the mind has learned to keep watch. There is something almost agricultural about this. Sleep cannot be pulled up by the roots to make it grow faster. The conditions around it have to be changed so that it becomes easier for it to take hold. The soil must be different. The timing must be different. The environment must stop sending mixed instructions. The person, instead of standing over the process and demanding a result, has to participate in a quieter form of retraining. This is why the path back to rest often looks less dramatic than people expect. It is not a single breakthrough. It is a gradual dismantling of habits that once felt necessary. The person begins learning not to measure every night so aggressively. They begin seeing that a bad night, while unpleasant, does not need to be treated as an emergency. They begin to stop negotiating with sleep minute by minute. They may leave the bed rather than remain there simmering in frustration. They may allow drowsiness to become the signal for bed. Rather than climbing in early out of fear, they may start building consistency not as a rigid ritual of self-protection, but as a steadier rhythm that helps the body know what to expect. At the same time, another level of treatment addresses the mind itself, though not by demanding that it become empty. That demand rarely works. The human mind is not a hallway that can be swept clean by command. Thoughts will come. Memories will come. Tomorrow will continue existing. What changes is the meaning assigned to those thoughts when they arise at night. Instead of treating every sign of wakefulness as proof that the night is failing, the person begins learning to see thoughts as events rather than verdicts. A passing worry is no longer evidence that sleep has been ruined. A period of alertness is no longer immediately translated into catastrophe. The mind's commentary loses some of its authority, not all at once, and not perfectly, but enough that the watchman is no longer obeyed as if it were the voice of reality itself. This change can sound gentle, but it is not superficial. It alters the emotional charge of the night. If a person no longer treats each moment of wakefulness as dangerous, then the nervous system has less reason to mobilize around it. If tomorrow is no longer imagined as unlivable after every imperfect night, then bedtime carries slightly less pressure. if thoughts are allowed to pass without being cross-examined. Then the mind spends less energy supervising itself. The night begins, in small ways, to lose its courtroom atmosphere. It no longer feels as though evidence is being gathered against the sleeper every minute they remain conscious. Sometimes treatment even makes use of a paradox that would seem almost like a joke if the problem were not so painful. Instead of trying harder to sleep, the person may be invited to stop chasing sleep altogether in the moment, or even to release the demand for it so completely that they give up the performance of forcing it. There is a quiet wisdom in this. The command sleep now contains tension within it. The softening of that command removes some of the tension. The goal is not to stay awake on purpose in a defiant way, but to step out of the exhausting contest between the will and the night. In that sense, letting go is not passivity. It is a disciplined withdrawal from the wrong kind of effort. This matters because many people hear the phrase "let go" and imagine something vague, mystical, or impossible. But in the world of insomnia, letting go is often highly practical. It means not turning every bad night into a referendum on tomorrow. It means not remaining in bed for hours trying to extract sleep by sheer endurance. It means reducing the behaviors that teach the body to associate bed with struggle. It means building trust in rhythm rather than chasing rescue night by night. It means allowing the system to recover some confidence that sleep can return without being forced under a spotlight. Of course, this is easier to describe than to do. The exhausted person does not easily relinquish control. The fear of another bad day is real. The temptation to calculate, optimize, brace, and prepare is strong. There may be nights when the old urgency returns with full force, when every fiber of the person wants to go back to monitoring and pleading and trying harder because trying harder still feels, at some deep instinctive level, like the responsible thing to do. Recovery is rarely linear. The Watchman does not vanish after a single insight. It loosens its grip gradually, often with setbacks, often with nights that still feel difficult, even while the broader system is beginning to change. But this is exactly why the treatment is so humane. It does not require the person to become perfectly calm or perfectly detached. It does not ask for a miraculous transformation of personality. It works with the reality of a human nervous system that has learned fear and can learn something else. The person does not have to become a different kind of creature. They only have to stop reinforcing the loop that has made the night so charged, and patiently allow new associations to form. Over time, something subtle begins to shift. Bedtime becomes a little less loaded. The bed carries a little less history. Wakefulness, when it appears, does not instantly bloom into panic or analysis. The day, while still affected by fatigue, is no longer organized so completely around guarding the next night. The person may still care deeply about sleep, but the caring becomes less urgent, less desperate, less entangled with minute-to-minute management. Sleep is still wanted. It is still valued, but it is no longer pursued as if it were prey. That change may seem small from the outside, yet it can alter everything. The nervous system begins to experience the night differently. Bed becomes more strongly linked again with sleep and less with frustration. Time in bed becomes denser with actual sleep and thinner with prolonged waiting. The mind, having been invited away from the role of supervisor, slowly discovers that it does not need to comment on every sensation and consequence. the body starts meeting the night under conditions that are more favorable, less contradictory, less crowded with effort. And because these shifts occur repeatedly, they can gradually undo the learning that once made insomnia feel so permanent. What is remarkable here is not only that the treatment works, though for many people it does, it is the deeper lesson hidden inside its logic. The return of sleep often begins not when a person finally discovers the perfect method of domination, but when they stop treating rest as something to be conquered. The body is helped, not commanded. The mind is guided, not silenced by force. The bed is reclaimed, not defended like a battlefield. The whole system begins to move away from struggle and toward permission. And that is why this section matters beyond sleep alone. By now it has become clear that insomnia is not just a nighttime inconvenience. It is a condensed example of something broader in human life. We are creatures who try to control what frightens us. We tighten around uncertainty. We supervise outcomes that do not fully belong to the will. We turn natural processes into projects the moment they begin to matter too much, in the case of sleep. This tendency becomes visible with unusual clarity because the harder we push, the more obvious the limit becomes. The night teaches, sometimes painfully, that not everything essential can be mastered through effort. Some things return only when the grip loosens. And once that truth begins to settle in, the documentary can widen beyond insomnia itself, because the sleepless mind, in all its vigilance and sincerity, is not only a medical subject, it is also a mirror, showing something fundamental about what it means to be conscious, vulnerable, and unable to think our way all the way into peace. By the time a person has lived through enough wakeful nights, the struggle begins to reveal something larger than sleep. At first, the problem seems practical. A person wants rest and cannot get it. They want tomorrow to feel bearable. They want the body to recover, the mind to quiet, the day to stop beginning with depletion. But after enough nights of trying, measuring, preparing, and failing, another truth begins to take shape beneath the practical one. The problem is not only that sleep is missing, the problem is that sleep belongs to a part of life that cannot be mastered in the usual way. That realization can be deeply unsettling. Most of modern life trains people toward mastery, learn more, plan further ahead, respond faster, organize the day, optimize the body, manage time more efficiently, notice patterns early, correct problems before they spread. These are not foolish instincts in many areas of life. They are genuinely useful. They help people work, care for others, build stability, survive uncertainty, and move through demanding worlds with some sense of agency. It would be strange if the same mind, trained so thoroughly in control, did not carry those habits into the night as well. And yet the night resists them. Not completely, of course. Knowledge helps. Rhythm helps. Light matters. Timing matters. Treatment helps. The body is not beyond influence, but influence is not the same as command. A person can prepare carefully for sleep and still fail to cross into it. They can understand the science, respect the rhythms, soften the habits that once kept them awake, and still discover that the final descent into sleep is not an act of will. It remains something closer to permission than conquest. That is what makes sleeplessness such an intimate human experience. It exposes a limit that many other parts of life allow us to ignore. During the day, people can often create the impression that enough effort solves almost everything. If the body is tired, there is coffee. If the mind is overwhelmed, there is planning. If emotion becomes unruly, there are words, routines, distractions, obligations, tasks. Even when these do not fully solve a problem, they can create movement. They allow a person to feel active rather than helpless. But at night, lying in darkness, stripped of most of the day's tools, a person comes closer to a simpler truth. There are states of being that cannot be pushed into existence. Rest is one of them. This is not because the mind is weak. It is because the mind is powerful in the wrong way for this particular task. It is excellent at anticipating, comparing, calculating, remembering, preparing, and defending. It can build futures before they arrive. It can return to old scenes and improve them, or replay them, or fear them. It can detect risk where no conscious thought has yet taken shape. It can notice what has changed in the body, in the room, in the hour, in the silence. These are not broken functions. They are deeply human functions. But when they remain active past the point where the organism needs release, the qualities that once looked intelligent begin to interfere with a different kind of intelligence. The older, quieter intelligence by which the body yields to sleep. There is something almost tragic in that. The person who cannot rest is often not failing because they care too little. They are often failing because too much of them remains engaged in caring. They are still preparing for what comes next, still keeping account, still holding some invisible thread, still trying, in their own exhausted way, to protect themselves from uncertainty. The night becomes difficult, not because the mind has ceased functioning, but because it has not agreed to stop functioning in quite the way sleep requires. That is why the sleepless night can become a kind of mirror. It shows the person how much of life is lived through vigilance, how much of identity is built around readiness, how reflexively the mind reaches towards supervision the moment something important becomes unstable. A person may discover, through insomnia, that their thoughts are not only about sleep, they are about consequence, uncertainty, self-trust, and control. They are about whether tomorrow can be handled, whether the body can be relied on, whether life can be entered again without perfect preparation. The night draws these questions into sharper focus because it offers so little distraction from them. In this sense, sleeplessness belongs not only to medicine, but to a broader human condition. Human beings are creatures who know too much about tomorrow. That knowledge is one of our great advantages. It allows foresight, responsibility, moral imagination, long-term care. But it also has a cost. We do not simply get tired, we know what tomorrow's tiredness might mean. We do not simply wake at 3 in the morning. We know what 3 in the morning suggests about the remaining hours, the next day, the week ahead, the self we fear becoming if the nights continue like this. Consciousness enlarges discomfort by placing it inside time. It takes a sensation and adds narrative to it. This is why a child can sometimes fall asleep in the middle of noise. Confusion, even under less than ideal conditions, while an adult lies awake in a quiet room with every comfort arranged. The adult is not weaker. The adult is more burdened by interpretation. The room is not merely a room. It is the setting for tomorrow's outcome. The hour is not merely an hour. It is evidence. The body is not merely tired. It is being assessed. Sleep becomes difficult, not just because the nervous system is activated, but because meaning has accumulated around the whole event. Modern life has made this accumulation easier. The world people inhabit now rarely goes fully dark in the deeper psychological sense. There is always another message, another article, another task unfinished, another decision postponed, another reason to stay mentally available. Even when the phone is put away and the lights are dimmed, the habits shaped by such a world do not vanish immediately. The mind has been trained to remain responsive. It learns to live in partial readiness, always somewhat on call, always somewhat unfinished. In that context, true rest can begin to feel less like a natural phase of life and more like an achievement that keeps being deferred. But the difficulty runs deeper than technology or modern schedules alone. Even without screens, even without work emails, even without late-night stimulation, the human mind would still face the ancient problem of surrender. Every night asks for a small act that is stranger than it first appears. To sleep is to stop keeping watch, to stop organizing the self around the world for a while, to release the future and trust that one can disappear into unconsciousness and return again. Most nights this happens so naturally that its strangeness goes unnoticed. Yet when it fails, the depth of the act becomes visible. Sleep is not only biological, it is existential in a quiet way. It asks the self to loosen its claim on continuity. This may be one reason chronic sleeplessness feels so intimate. It is not simply fatigue. It is repeated difficulty with letting the self recede. And yet there is another side to this, something gentler. If insomnia reveals the limits of mastery, it also offers the possibility of a different relationship to oneself. Many people who struggle with sleep spend a long time treating the problem as a private indictment. They call themselves broken, too anxious, too sensitive, too dependent on routine, too incapable of doing what should come naturally. But the deeper understanding of insomnia asks for a more compassionate interpretation. The mind that refuses rest is often not malicious. It is often overprotective. It is keeping too much online, guarding too much, preparing too continuously. It is treating the night as significant because somewhere along the way, significance gathered there. Seen this way, the sleepless person begins to look less like someone who has failed at rest and more like someone whose system has become overcommitted to protection. Protection from what? From the next day's exhaustion, from unpredictability, from bodily uncertainty, from emotional collapse, from the memory of previous nights, from the fear that if vigilance drops, something will go wrong. These protections do not have to be conscious to shape the night. They can live in patterns, tensions, expectations, and habits of attention. But once they are recognized, something important changes. The person no longer has to fight themselves as an enemy. They can begin understanding the struggle as a misplaced form of self-preservation. This matters because compassion changes arousal. Not instantly, not magically, but meaning matters to the nervous system. If wakefulness is interpreted as catastrophe, the body remains mobilized around it. If wakefulness is interpreted as evidence of personal defect, shame deepens the activation. But if wakefulness is understood as an overlearned pattern, a state with structure rather than a verdict on character, then some of the emotional violence around the night can begin to soften. The person may still be tired, still frustrated, still longing for sleep, but they are no longer adding as much self-accusation to the experience. The struggle loses a layer of cruelty, and in losing that cruelty, it sometimes loses some of its power. This is one of the quiet gifts of scientific understanding. Good science does not make the night less human. It makes it more intelligible. It shows that the sleepless mind is not a chaos beyond comprehension. It has rhythms, conditioning, timing, habits of attention, physiological activation, learned associations. It has causes and patterns, even when those causes are complex. To understand those patterns is not to strip the night of feeling. It is to replace helpless confusion with a form of respect. The body is doing something. The mind is doing something. Both can be approached with more clarity than panic allows. That clarity does not eliminate mystery completely, nor should it. There remains something irreducible about sleep. Even after all the measurements, all the theories, all the clinical insights into hyperarousal, timing, stimulus control, cognitive change, and physiological regulation, the moment of falling asleep still belongs to a threshold. Science can describe better than it can fully domesticate. There is humility in that. It reminds us that human life, however measurable in parts, is still lived from the inside as a series of passages we do not entirely command. Sleep is one of the most ordinary of these passages, and one of the most revealing. It reminds us that the body is not a machine we own so much as a living system we inhabit. We can care for it, we can study it, we can influence it wisely or poorly, but we cannot fully dominate it without cost. The same is true of the mind. It is not merely a tool for solving problems. It is also a source of weather, memory, vigilance, fear, imagination, meaning, and release. At night, when one wants only peace, this complexity can feel unbearable, yet it is also what makes the struggle worthy of more than irritation. The sleepless night reveals the strange dignity and difficulty of being a conscious creature whose survival depends on letting consciousness go for a while each day. Perhaps that is why recovery from insomnia, when it begins, often feels deeper than simple symptom relief. Of course, it is a relief to sleep again, to wake without dread, to pass through bedtime without negotiation, to stop living under the pressure of the next night. But for many people, the change carries another lesson too. They begin to see that rest came back not when they finally outsmarted themselves, but when they stopped demanding perfect control. Not when they became stronger in the daytime sense, but when they allowed the night to stop being a contest. Not when they erased vulnerability, but when they stopped treating vulnerability as failure. That lesson extends far beyond the bedroom. There are many parts of life where people suffer because they try to supervise too closely what can only be supported indirectly. Love is often like this. Grief is often like this. Confidence, creativity, trust, even joy. These things do not bloom under aggressive inspection. They need structure. Yes, they need conditions, but they also need space. They require a kind of openness the controlling mind finds difficult to offer. Sleep belongs in that family of experiences. It can be invited, protected, honored, but not seized. So the broader meaning of the sleepless mind may be this. The mind that will not rest at night is not only revealing a problem with sleep, it is revealing one of the oldest tensions in human life. The tension between vigilance and surrender, between preparedness and trust. between the self that manages and the deeper life that unfolds only when management relaxes. To live well requires both. There are times for alertness, effort, mastery, deliberate thought. There are also times when those same gifts become burdens if they refuse to step aside. Night is one of those times. And perhaps the final comfort is not that the struggle is simple, because it is not simple, nor that understanding alone will instantly restore rest, because understanding is only part of the path. The comfort is that the struggle has meaning without being destiny. It follows patterns. It reflects habits of mind and body that can change. It says something about the human condition, but it does not pronounce a permanent sentence on the person living through it. The body can relearn safety. The bed can lose its charge. The mind can loosen its watch and rest when it returns. Often returns not as a trophy for perfect effort, but as something quieter and older, something that had been waiting all along for the conditions in which it could finally arrive without being forced. By the end of this journey, the sleepless night looks a little different than it did at the beginning. It is still uncomfortable, still lonely in its own peculiar way, still made of long minutes and unwanted awareness. But it no longer appears as a simple failure of will, or a mysterious defect in a tired person who should be able to sleep and somehow cannot. What the science and the lived experience behind it slowly reveals is something gentler and more complex. The mind that will not rest is often not broken. It is often trying, in its own misguided way, to protect, predict, measure, solve, or prepare. It keeps watch when watchfulness is no longer needed. It treats the night as something to manage, and in doing so, it moves further from the very condition that sleep requires. There is something quietly profound in that discovery. Sleep is one of the few things in life that cannot be mastered by force. Knowledge can help. Treatment can help. Habit, timing, and patience can help. But the final step into sleep still belongs to a part of human life that cannot be commanded directly. It asks for conditions, not conquest. It asks for trust more than control. In that sense, the night reveals something larger than insomnia alone. It shows how difficult it can be for a thinking creature to stop thinking, for a planning creature to stop preparing, for a self-aware mind to loosen its grip on the world even for a few hours. And yet the same scientific curiosity that helps us understand this struggle can also soften it. It can replace self-blame with recognition, panic with pattern, and shame with a clearer view of what the mind is doing in the dark. So if the mind has seemed stubborn, restless, or hard to quiet, perhaps the first comfort is this: the struggle itself has meaning. It has structure. It can be understood. And sometimes, understanding is the beginning of the calm that effort alone could never bring.